Thank you so much. Last seminar of the season. Go. Look, this is a proper test of resilience. Go for it. Over to you.
Very quick.
No, take your time. Take your time.
Right.
We're good. We're good.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation, first of all. So I'm going to go with you a bit in a story about computational HCI, work that was mainly done back in my PhD in the University of Bayreuth in northern Bavaria, before I started my postdoc at the University of Glasgow. And to begin with, I want you to think about the tons of hours that you spend conducting user studies, and especially if you're working with like movement and maybe try to figure out the ergonomics of interaction techniques, then you will also need some annoying equipment that can take a lot of time. And as soon as you get it working, you still need to like post-process data, get the position of these markers into joint angles to then figure out the ergonomics of things. And the annoying thing is that we need to do those studies, for example, to find out what are the best parameters for interaction techniques. This example of the virtual pad, where you can basically decide where this pad will be. And you usually want to find parameters that lead to the best performance or best ergonomics. And the way that we are doing this is we choose some initial parameters, then we run a user study, we collect movement data, so this is the annoying part, then we update our parameters and do this thing again until we run out of time usually. And what I'm proposing is to replace the user studies here, at least partly, with simulations. And the neat thing about simulations like this one is that we can not only run our user studies with this computer and test a lot of parameters in parallel, but we can also get out the ergonomics data directly from the system, so we don't have to do all this kind of struggling with motion capturing data. To perform such simulations, we have to see, or one way is to see HCI as an optimal control problem. And to those who are not that familiar with the theory of this, I will explain it shortly with this example. So the user on the left is trying to control this virtual object. And what the user is doing here is choosing muscle control signals to change their body state, which is then sensed by the input device. We can collect in input device states, and then this changes the application or the interface states by moving this virtual object, for example. And finally, this movement is then perceived by the user through a head-mounted display or haptic or audio feedback. And we can model this loop as one set of differential equations that, given a certain state of the system, and with state I mean the user state, the input device state, and the interface state, and a given muscle control signal of the user, we can forward the system in time to get the new system state after this activation is applied. And then there's one question, so if we can model this, then there's another question that we need to answer. That is also what the user needs to think about, is which control signal am I choosing? And therefore we assume the rational acting human. So there will be some internal cost function that the user tries to minimize with their movements. And this can have factors like the movement speed or effort costs. And the user has to solve this optimal control problem subject to the constraints given by the human-computer system dynamics. So this could be, for example, that you can't move your arm in another way than your body allows to, and also the cursor may not leave the screen, for example. So we have like two things that we have to look at to model the system, and then we have to find a cost function and solve the optimal control problem. So my talk is basically now structured in two parts. We have the classic optimal feedback control on one hand, and deep reinforcement learning on the other hand, and they both try to solve this optimal control problem, but they are different in some in some ways that I will come to later. And to start off, we're going to look at a very simple model, and but which is basically the first thing that you will learn when you come into control theory, which is a linear quadratic regulator. For this, we will look at a model of 1D mouse pointing, so basically the simplest model that you can think about. And we can design our human-computer system dynamics as being linear, and the cost function as being quadratic. The system in this case can be as simple as this second-order lag, or it's like a spring damper system where you can apply force directly to this mouse pointer that is attached to a spring that pulls it back. And the cost function in this case can be as simple as taking the distance cost from the mouse cursor to the target. And we also added jerk, which is like a very common term you might have heard about the minimum jerk model. With this, we can already simulate some mouse pointing. So as you can see here on the left, the position trajectory of that mouse cursor, in blue of the simulation and green of real human data. But we can also see that there are some small parts of the movement that we can't capture with a simple model. And you can see it especially well in the velocity trajectory, that there are these sub-movements that our model is just too simple to capture these. But still, with these simpler models, we can do some interesting simulations. So if we add another part that is saccades, so the quick eye movement of the eye fixation point from, in this case, the starting position to the target position. And then we model some uncertainty about the target position. So the user model is not certain about where the target is, but will learn about the target position over time. And especially after the saccade occurred, it will get better information about where the target actually is. So we can see here the model about the belief about the target position, and starting off with this dashed line, and then going from red to blue is over time how this distribution shifts. And especially after the saccade occurred, this is around 0.05 seconds in this example, the belief gets a lot better and closer to the actual target. And then with this also modeled, we can see some simple effects of the saccade time. So if we move the saccade, which is displayed by these black lines, back in time, then we would also see that the mouse movements will become slower and reach the target later. So this just as an example for a very simple model that can be done with a linear quadratic system. But this is not where we want to stop. So I'll continue to the more interesting part. This is a model predictive control that we need to use to solve nonlinear systems. And the system that we want to look at is this biomechanical model of a human, or more precisely of the right upper extremity of a human. And this system is, as I said, nonlinear, especially in the shoulder. And it is modeled in a fast physics simulator that's called Muchoko. And that also has contact dynamics. So if you would like to, you could also model interactions in like limited spaces. To make things a bit more interesting here we added a second order muscle model to also simulate the build-up time that muscles have. So they will not apply torque immediately, but need a few milliseconds to apply the full force. Then as a input device, we added a simple, like a motion capture marker, but in this virtual model of the interface. And then we can use the position of this marker to apply different transfer functions. For example, the simple virtual cursor that is just a a translation of that point in space. Now, this models the whole human-computer system dynamic. We can apply a muscle activation on the left side. This will move our model. That will move the virtual input device and therefore also change the position of the virtual cursor. Like I said, to solve these nonlinear models, now we need a different controller, and that is where model predictive control comes into play. I'll just go through that so that you get an understanding how the simulation actually works. And what's also very interesting here is that you can actually understand why the model is moving like it is. So in model predictive control, instead of solving the usually infinite time horizon problem, we cut down the problem in a fixed time horizon and only look at this problem in the next n time steps. And then we try to minimize this stage cost L that only depends on the state of the current time and the applied control. Of course, we also need to solve this problem subject to the constraints, again, given by the human-computer system dynamics. So this is just a mathematical formulation of saying, okay, the system behaves like we modeled it. And when we solve this, we obtain a so-called optimal open loop control trajectory U star. And if applied, we can then also get the optimal state open loop state trajectory, which is now here displayed in blue. And this can be seen from a human-computer interaction perspective as the plan of a user for the next n time steps. So this is also assuming that humans have an internal prediction about what is happening in the next n time steps. But then instead of simply following this plan for this time, we would only apply the first part of it and then result in a new system state x1. And importantly, this state can differ from what we planned with just because of some unmodeled uncertainties, for example. And now the idea of MPC is, okay, we just move our horizon by one time step. We now have a new starting point, and we do the same thing again. And we do this as long as we want to, or as long as we are still moving. We've just finished when we reach our target. And a very cool thing here is then this black line here contains all the information that we need. So all the joint angles over time, the cursor positions over time. So this is actually the simulation of the interaction. So we don't have to train anything or run hours of evaluation. So we just get the simulation directly from performing this MPC. Now, I have not told you what the stage cost is. This is basically similar to the 1D task. Now we have our task is a 3D ISO pointing task where we have this circle of targets, and you have to move the cursor to the active target, and then the next target will spawn on the opposite side. And we chose to model 3 different cost functions here. The first one is also just the distance between the cursor position and the current target. And then we added an effort term that is just penalizing the control value directly. So you could say this is basically move to the target with using as less activation as possible. Then we added a second term to that, or a third term to that, that is well known from motor control theory, that is commanded torque change. This also penalizes the torque that is directly coming from the activation. So any torque that is just coming from gravity is not included. And the last part, or last function that we evaluated was joint acceleration. So instead of this commanded torque change, we have the combined joint accelerations in all the joints as another penalization term. Now you might have noticed these R1 and R2 parameters. These are weight parameters that define the trade-off between those terms. And it's quite important to choose these correctly. And to do this, because we want our simulations in the end to be as human-like as possible, we ran a little user study with this task and 6 different users that we all, for all of these, we built different models and also for 4 different interaction techniques. Then we can compare the resulting trajectories of the user data with our simulation and basically evaluate how well our simulation is predicting the movements of this user. And with this, we could then run a parameter optimization, which takes 5 different movements or targeted movements and finds the parameters R1 and R2 that lead to the best or closest matching movements of the simulation. As we need to run like 5 different simulations to evaluate one set of parameters, this takes quite a long time. That's why we decided to use a gradient-free optimization method. It's called CMIS. Also, because this method is an evolutional strategy, it might not give us the optimal results, but maybe it's just something that is close to optimal. That's why in the next step, we try to analyze, okay, how important is it to choose these parameters right? And on an example of the joint acceleration cost, you can see that if we fixate the effort cost term and then increase the weight for the joint acceleration, we can see that these movements get slower and slower as expected. But you can also see that the overshoot at the target increases, which is probably due to the fact that we're also penalizing deceleration. So it's also costly for the model to decelerate fast, and will just lead to smoother movements if we increase this value. We can also do that in a bit more thorough analysis. So now if we model, if we simulate a lot of different pairs of these weights, and then in the z-axis we have the resulting root mean squared error between the simulation movements and the real user data, we can see that this actually gives us like a convex area, which we didn't expect in the first place. So this was quite nice, since it raised the hope that even if we're not exactly at the right pair, right value pair, then we still have like similar performance. So now with these coast weights in place, we can actually start simulating movements. And you can see here a comparison of real user data replayed in our simulation, and then the 3 different coast functions. And one thing that I want to you to look at is, in case of this just distance and control coasts, we can see that the model has problems reaching the targets that are high up. And this is due to the fact that to reach speeds that are human-like, these effort cost weights have to be very high. And therefore, it gets very costly to work against gravity, and movements that try to reach to the top are not working anymore for the model. The other 2 look quite well, and then we can, when we did a quantitative comparison of these 3, you can also see that the joint acceleration cost outperformed the other 2 in cursor positions as well as in the joint angles when compared to real user data. So that's why we continued analyzing the simulation with this joint acceleration cost and compared them directly to the user data again in a way that you can think about this when you're performing a user study and one of your users becomes ill. You can either use another user to replace this one, or you could run a simulation to replace the user that didn't make it. And so these results are comparing our simulation against these other users, and as well as in the cursor positions, as in the joint angles, our simulations or in the cursor positions, they are equal than the other users. within the joint angles, we outperform other users, but that is mainly due to the fact that we have a model of that ill user that we can use. And other users might have different physiologies, which lead to different joint angles in this case. So now we have the simulations in place, we can think about different applications. And one thing which I also mentioned in the beginning, we can now simulate interactions with different parameters. So here you can see a virtual pad that is just projecting the fingertip to the front. You can also see it well in this shadow on the right. And when we now also add a translation of this cursor upwards, then we can see that the simulation is performing these movements with a lowered elbow. We can go back one more time. And so we can infer basically the ergonomic criteria from these simulations directly. So this concludes the first part of my talk about the optimal feedback control. And now I want to talk a little bit about what we've done more recently is using deep reinforcement learning with these models. So first of all, the main comparison or main differences between reinforcement learning and optimal feedback control is that now instead of finding an optimal control, we are searching for an optimal policy that is given by different parameters of our deep neural network and based on the current state that we are in or the observations that we get. And instead of a cost function that we try to minimize, we now try to maximize the reward function. So that's basically the same idea behind these two. But the way reinforcement learning is working now is we have the policy that predicts a optimal muscle control signal, sends that to our assisted dynamics, and then we get observation and rewards out of this, which we then can put back in the policy, and then we can learn we can use different policy learning algorithms to update our parameters in this deep neural network, and in the end, obtain an optimal policy. So the first example that we've shown here was just a tracking task. And as you can see here, there are some flaws in this model. So it has like a tilted wrist, which you would normally not see in human movement. But apart from that, it's able to follow this cursor, this target position, and it also fulfills like Fitts law and the two-third power law. But to fix these problems with the model, we then went on to use a bit more advanced biomechanical model. And this is also the first work that we've done with the user in the box project. And there we have a more complex muscle model that you can also now see. And the agent is directly controlling these muscles. And we also added an observation module that now directly takes the RGB and depth information from the environment and uses this as an observation for the reinforcement learning algorithm. You can see what the agent is seeing on the lower right. So it has a very low resolution, but it's also able to learn these pointing tasks. It also fulfills Fitts law. And then we went on using this agent to train on a little bit more complex tasks. So the first one was, or the second one was also tracking, now with like a randomly moving target. Then we had a choice reaction task, which is basically click on the button with the right color. So that this uses the RGB information of the observation. And then the most complex task that we tried on was controlling this remote control car to stop in the green box. And this task is especially complicated because the agent first needs to learn to point the finger at the joystick and then move the joystick up and down to accelerate and decelerate the car. So there's a lot more to think about involved, and training of these agents also took, I think, around 3 days. So yeah, but in theory, the agent is able to perform these interaction tasks, and we can also use the muscle activation to infer ergonomic criteria of interaction techniques. Now, coming to the last work for this talk, which I'm very excited about because it just got accepted at WIST this year, and it's called Sim2VR. Now, one thing that our models previously did were interacting with an environment that was also modeled inside the physics engine. So we introduced basically an offset between the real virtual environment and the environment that we modeled. Because ideally, you would want the agent to work with the same environment as users do. And that's why we implemented a bridge between our simulation and a classic VR application. This is now modeled in Unity. And we had this example of a whack-a-mole game where the simulated user and real users could play the same game, basically. And the simulation also gets its observations directly from the Unity game. And the movements of the virtual controller are directly sent to the application in return. Now, this allows us to find out about, for example, performance of different conditions. So here we had basically 3 difficulties in the game that changed the amount of simultaneous targets that were shown. And we can see that our simulations performed similar than different users. And the most interesting part that we can also do now with this Sim2VR is directly predict user strategies in these different situations. And to test that, we had 2 different versions of the game, basically. One constrained version where you had to hit the targets with a certain end velocity, and an unconstrained version, we just need to touch the targets. But we didn't tell the users in the study about that. So we just showed them the 2 different conditions. And what we've seen in the simulation is that on the left-hand side, you can see those big movements to gain velocity on the hammer. And on the right side, we saw what we didn't predict before is that the simulation learned to just move around the target area to touch the targets, because it was faster and more efficient than the other technique. And then when we conducted the user study, we could see that I think 2 out of the was it like 12 users or 13 users, they also learned this strategy in the unconstrained version. So this is basically an example that when we run our studies with the simulation first, we could maybe predict these strategies that we don't want to see maybe, and then adjust our application beforehand. So to wrap things up, we've seen that we can use linear quadratic models for like simple interactions, but they may be not sufficient to show all the details of human motion. That's why we went on to use nonlinear models. We added a simplified second-order muscle model and went on with a model predictive control. There we've seen that the choice of the cost function is actually very important, and that a combination of distance, effort, and joint acceleration costs perform best for this model, and that we can actually predict movements between user variants. And last but not least, we've seen that when we apply deep reinforcement learning to do the same problem. We can tackle more complex tasks. We can also add in like visual and proprioceptive feedback and predict user studies directly in the VR application. Now, where can we go from here? So one obvious thing that we can do is generalize our simulations to various interaction tasks, users and environments. So for example, this is my latest study that I did then back in Bayreuth, was using these use-in-the-box model to perform raycasting. There was also a Kai paper about from one of Anti's PhD students about the same application, basically. And then we can finally use these simulations, as I said in the beginning, to run an optimization of interaction technique parameters without having to conduct a lot of user studies in this process. And then maybe run a user study directly with already improved parameters. One thing that you could also do, if the simulations are running fast enough, you could think about adapting the interaction technique online. This would be very interesting for augmented reality applications. I think when you also, like, you think about moving to another room and the application would adjust to the new room, and then maybe enable different kinds of interactions. And the last thing that I want you to think about is, now this is very mechanical, these are very mechanical simulations, and the only bit about cognitive is maybe choosing the right cost function. So what would be very interesting to add more sophisticated cognitive models. And just a little point out to where I'm working now is active inference, which is basically one way to think about how living beings act in an environment. So this might be quite interesting when we come to combining active inference with these simulations. So with this, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much. Do you have any questions or comments?
I have a question. Thank you. I just happened to have been looking at similar sort of control things for very different purposes. I am not very much in touch with this part of the HCI literature recently, but what kind of studies with real users would this allow you to shortcut on? That's something that I think you're taking for obvious, but as someone who hasn't looked at that for a while, it was not completely obvious to me.
Yeah. So I think that most studies don't really look very precise on these parameters, for example. But usually you just run a pilot study, and then you just take the first set of parameters that work well. So maybe it could be like a step before running any other user studies to apply these simulations to find a better starting point. So that's something that I could see.
I remember that you mentioned parameters at the very beginning, or towards the beginning, but again, as someone who is really not looking at that at all recently, what kind of parameters are we talking about?
So for example, I can find that. I have a slide on that.
Bubblehead. Oh yeah, bubblehead. Yeah.
So, I mean, on like very simple interaction techniques like this virtual cursor, you already have the translation that is involved that we can try to optimize. And when you look at an interaction like the virtual pad, there are actually already, I think, like 4 different values that you need to somehow fix. So usually you would probably go with just a pad that is parallel to the ground, but you could maybe also think about tilting this pad to improve the interaction, which is maybe something that has not been looked into that much yet.
So
this is
sorry.
no.
So just to see if I understand. So basically, you have like a virtual touchpad, like you have a touchpad in VR, and you're basically thinking about how to orientate it, where to place it compared to the user. That's the kind of Thanks. That's
to finally improve the ergonomics of the interaction that you're looking at. Yeah, but what's also quite interesting, because I also mentioned that Michoko allows these contact dynamics. So you could also think about optimizing existing interaction techniques for constrained spaces, like an airplane seat, for example, where you have this other seat in front of you, and maybe not all of the movements that would be possible when you're just standing in an open space are possible in this airplane. And then the simulation could predict that it's not possible to reach there because there's an airplane seat. And then you could see that when testing your application, and then adapt your application.
Thank you. That's brilliant.
I couldn't help. The last, when you're looking to the future, you're talking, I forget the phrasing that you used in that slide, but it's kind of like it's a repeat of history in a way. My question is going to be one about social, like that's where we went to naturally, running 20 years ago. But you know, with these with the whack-a-mole video, I couldn't help but thinking of like Paul Marshall's work and just showing how people's learning to interact with any of these things is a lot can be learned from just playing a game, so intuitive interaction. But so much of this is often done in a social setting where we look to see what the other person did with the tool, and then we pick it up from that. Yeah. But these models don't get that kind of, they're just learning from first principles themselves, right? They are like an infant whacking by themselves. But you know, is there scope to bring in that kind of like observational input that you might get from observing others?
So one thing that we did, I mean, went in this direction is we had one of these agents that just tried to point somewhere in a space where you could also enter as a human. So basically you would have this, I don't know if I have a picture of that, but basically you would have that, that you could see the agent in VR, and you could stop the agent in the motion, and then it would try to like move around your arm, for example, or you could place objects in the space and it would try to avoid those objects to then point to the target. So maybe that goes in the direction, or you could also think about having multiple agents.
That's what I was thinking of, right? Yeah,
in one space.
Yeah, one might be learning from the other, and then adults. So not always learning from these first principles themselves. It just seems before that, you know, so much this is about the kind of internal learning that's happening themselves, but a lot of what we know is that we learn from watching others.
So I guess it's quite complicated to include communication in that, and you would need some way to, like, these agents can communicate other than just moving. But yeah, basically you could take the pre-trained agent and then retrain that agent while there's another agent moving around. And then it could actually show some of these.
And I guess the reason for bringing this up, it's always about scope of fit. I mean, what I like about this talk is it is theory, and that's what, you know, it's one of the things we've had seminars recently talking about the importance of theory in HCI. And the point is that you can run these computational models and actually get predictions out of them. So it's not just some kind of, it's not just simple observations. It's not just kind of wooden statements. You actually got something here that can run. But it does seem that one of the things we do know about people is that they are inherently social, and they learn so much from not just their own interactions with the world, but also watching other people's and inferring from that. So it just seems like a major part of how we learn needs to be still captured in these models potentially.
So maybe that would also be cool if we had like cognitive models that could basically show some social features as well. What I've seen recently was basically like an emotional model, this like cube emotional model that we could maybe include.
Yeah, could you develop a model where it's doing a pointing task, which, or maybe trying to find a projector that works, which is an increasingly difficult challenge, right? And then eventually it gets more and more frustrated, and as a result, misses the button or something. Anyone else have any questions? No. Well, pass it. Thank you.
I was interested how the deep reinforcement learning model was able to simulate how the user was going to move and interact with the whack-a-mole puzzle. And I was interested on how you would like do that for, I guess, individuals with muscle deteriorating like diseases. Like, would you be able to make an RL model that could adapt based off like a user's progress or deterioration?
Yeah. It's an amazing question. So there are a few things for that. So the most basic thing that we could do is, if you look at this model, of course, we could just remove some of the muscles from the model or make them very weak. And then you would have a model that could show some of these effects. But what was also what we, I think there's, I don't know if I have a video of that. It was something recently added to the Mayo suite, which is working with the same like Muchoko models that showed like increasing fatigue of muscles. So when you use them, and then the model would also like slow down with the movements, and in the end, maybe not perform them as well anymore. So there's things to work with. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I thought it was really interesting. I'm wondering like so this model mostly looks at the arm movements. I'm wondering how precise you can go. So if you're doing like gesture controls, like with fingers, like is that something that can also be sort of simulated as well? And how precise can it be?
So the reason why we only looked at arm was that basically the models that were there back then were the most precise models were just of this upper arm. And we're still missing hand and finger models because the hands are very complicated. There are like, I think, at least 30 muscles that just move the hand. And one problem also is that they are mainly attached somewhere else. So if you just model a hand, it's not very precise.
Right.
And also, if we add the hand here, I think this is also around 30 muscles working already. You will get a very large controlled space, which then takes a lot of time to learn these models. But also these MyoSuit guys, they have also, it's more about motor control directly, but they have a hand model that can, for example, juggle objects in the hand. And you could think about using one of their models to train gestures. So it could be possible, but we've not done that yet.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
In the past I was super interested in deep RL and applying it, but my field more works on like EEG, like neural data. And due to the neural data, the amount of variance you have is not simple as like you have a pen out. Everyone's going to grab the pen in the same method, but with EEG or FNIRS, it's going to react differently to different stimulus. I wanted to see if you had any opinions on if you were to train a deep RL model, would it even be possible? Like, would you be able to create a kind of optimal policy or general policy for everyone, or is that something that's not a likelihood at the moment?
You mean train it on EEG data?
Yeah. For instance, if the actioned RL model was to relay feedback to the user and it has to know how the user will react to the feedback, is that even a possibility, or is that too complex?
I mean, so in order to train it in a reinforcement learning approach, you would need to have simulation of the EEG in the first place. But I think you could probably do that with the model that we have. So you could place a virtual EEG on these muscles and use the data that you get out of the simulation.
The EEG.
The brain. Yeah. Sorry. I was confusing those. Okay, I mean, that's probably harder with that model. But then you would need to model the processes directly in the brain. So I'm not sure if that has been done yet with like a reinforcement learning approach. I guess
I think it's too far off at the moment. It's
probably we need to understand the brain better to be able to run simulations on a brain model. that are not data-based. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
So thank you.
Okay. Thank you.